So welcome everybody. Welcome to the CCC public lecture featuring Alia Malek, Dr. Nadine Sino, Dr. J Keel, and moderated by Katherine Randall. I'm Nada Barada. I am a PhD candidate in the interdisciplinary aspect program here at Virginia Tech and also serve proudly as the president of the CCC. Today's program could not have been really possible without the support and sponsoring of the Community Change Collaborative, VT Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies, as well as the Center for Rhetoric in Society. So we'd like to really thank them for working and collaborating and making this event possible. Before I start, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the Community Change Collaborative, especially for the new members here joining us today. The CCC is actually an interdisciplinary group affiliated with the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance. It has actually been established for over a decade now. CCC members are faculty, students, and community members from really all walks of life and disciplines. And really, and I use here we have an interest in really trying to understand the forces that shape community development and how to build sustainable cross-sectoral partnerships. And we have manifested that engagement through really numerous projects, one of which is the faculty forums and public talks like this one, really hosting a world-class community leaders. The latest to date is Lilier, and her public talk is actually available on YouTube. Make sure you check it out. We also actually work on different community-based projects and conduct a group research project. The latest to date is actually a work review in the framing narratives of favelas in Brazil in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as actually an exhibit that will be available at the library and probably online too very soon. Another also way in which we manifest that commitment is through a podcast series that is professionally developed entitled Trustees Without Borders, led by the help of senior fellow, who we thank very much, fellow Andy. And in fact, actually, Alia Malek has been very kind to accept to participate in another podcast following this talk. So make sure also that you listen to her podcast at the end when it would become available. And none of this actually, neither this talk would have happened without the help of Dr. Max Stephenson, who is the director of the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance and professor of public and international affairs, who is actually our faculty advisors. And of course, without mentioning the members who are committed and participate vigorously every week in our weekly meetings, as well as different activities. So I'm really, really happy today to welcome the guest, Alia Malek. Her talk has been a long due, one that was planned actually in the pre-COVID era and was unfortunately sort of postponed in the light of these, but we're so happy to make it possible this semester again in a virtual format. So our guest speaker today is Alia Malek. She is the director of the International Reporting Program at the Greg Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY in New York, the university, also a journalist and formal civil rights lawyer. Alia is the author of A Country Called America, US History Retold Through Arab American Lives, published in 2009, and editor of Patriot Acts, Narratives of Post 9/11 Injustices, published in 2011. With collaborators with the Magnum Foundation and Al Liquidoi, Alia also edited and co-conceived Europa, an illustrated introduction to Europe for migrants and refugees, released in Europe in 2016. Her narrative nonfiction book, that's actually also in my nightstand, and I've had really the pleasure to read and highly recommend it, entitled The Home That Was Our Country, a Memoir of Syria, was released in 2017. Her reportage has appeared in numerous places, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, The Nation, The Christian Science Monitor, Jadalia, Mike Sweeney's, Guernica, and other publications. And we are very, very pleased to have her. And probably if we were in a room together, we'd have loud cheers here. But again, welcome again, Alia, to Virginia Tech and to the CCC. We're very happy to have you. After her talk, there will be a panel, and this panel is led by dear CCC members and also Virginia Tech faculty and current students and past students. Among those is Katherine Randall. She is a PhD candidate in the Rhetoric and Writing program at Virginia Tech, who also volunteers as a medical coordinator for the Blacksburg Refugee Partnership, known as BRP. Her dissertation work focuses on medical resettlement for refugees in the United States, specifically looking at how health communication works through community volunteers. She and her husband and their 4-year-old daughter and their 3 cats have lived in Blacksburg since 2016. Currently, she enjoys both cross-stitching and watching YouTube videos about how to be good at cross-stitching. And I love that. Dr. Nadine Sino, who I'm very happy to see here, at least virtually, was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon. She is currently an associate professor of Arabic and director of the Arabic program at Virginia Tech, and we're very lucky to have her. Her research interests include modern Arabic literature and cultural studies. More specifically, she explores Arab and Muslim feminism, including representations of Muslim women in literature and film, Muslim mothering and Arab mothers' war diaries, as well as gender and sexuality and visual culture. She has experienced interpreting for Iraqi, Sudanese, and Syrian refugees in Lebanon and the United States. Last but not least is Dr. J Keel, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Calhoun Center for Higher Education Innovation. He is an alumni of the PGG program, and his research focuses on the displacement caused by the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and qualitative exploration of the resettlement of Iraqi refugees in the United States. I've had the pleasure to read snippets of his dissertation, and it's really impressive. Dr. Keel has also served as a board member and treasurer for the Blacksburg Refugee Partnership since late 2016. So for the lecture portion, at least of today's program, we ask please that everyone mute themselves and turn off their videos. And this is just to ensure that the connection is as stable as possible. So there will be first, again, Alia Malek's talk from 12-ish to about 12:45. Again, we'll try to give you as much as possible of a general timing. And then after Alia Malek's talk, we will have a break of 5 minutes, and then the panel with the Q&A will follow. As you ask your questions, please make sure that you either mention them in the chat box or that you actually unmute yourselves and put your video to ask, and make sure to introduce yourselves before, if possible, please. Alia, finally, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. You'd like me to keep it to 40 minutes or stop at 12:45, which is 30 minutes?
So how about we play it by ears? So keep in mind around 12:45 that, this would be a little bit the time, but if you exceed it, that's totally okay. And we'll
okay, well, I can also try to cut things out. I'm going to put the timer on, but the best thing about this being virtual is I can't see you giving me this signal. I usually give it talks.
But
okay.
Yeah, you'll have about 30 minutes, and if you feel like taking longer, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
I'm sure our panelists will also be flexible with regards to their time.
Okay. Well, I can also try. I mean, as the time goes, I can skip things. I had time for 40, but let's give it a go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here in this Zoom live. This is I usually like to ask an audience if anybody here has been to Syria, but I can't see you now. So I'll just imagine that you all have, and that you all have thoughts and ideas that nonetheless we can get to later together when we discuss things together. I thank you for being here. I know there's a lot competing for our attention these days, and I know these are super interesting times. People's children are at home, we're at home, so I'm going to do my best to try to keep this as interesting for you as possible and as relevant for you as possible. But thank you for being here. So to just sort of jump into it, since I can't see you and I can't ask the questions that I usually get to ask, I would just say that I've learned from both my personal experiences as well as from my professional work that the question of home, of where is it, is fairly inevitable once people have left the only home they've ever known. And whether they've left by choice or not, the question surfaces if it's not already ever present. If the answer to the question of where is home is patently clear to some, it can perplex, taunt, and even torture others. It's the stuff of much art and literature after all. In my own family, my father was one of those for whom the answer was patently clear. Home was and always would be Syria. He had come to the US in 1969 to complete a residency in internal medicine before specializing, with the dream that he would return to Syria and open his own state-of-the-art clinic to serve those most in need. He had come from a poor family, and even as he achieved comfortable middle-class status in the US, he kept thinking of himself as someone who was in many ways still poor. It informed him in a lot of ways. His preference that we play sports like soccer, which you could sort of pick up anywhere, and his disapproval of sports like golf and tennis because he perceived them to be too bourgeois. I mean, he was full of contradictions. But in his early years in America, in the attempt to sort of fulfill and actualize that dream, he would work by day in Baltimore and by night moonlighted 100 miles away in rural Maryland, saving money to buy expensive surgical equipment. But he had left the country a year before Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current ruler, Bashar al-Assad, carried out the coup that ushered in this current regime, which, as of this week, has now been in power for 50 years. That's 5 decades. But despite the coming of power of Hafiz al-Assad, at the time, my father was not dissuaded. After all, coups, counter coups, attempted coups, those were kind of a regular feature of Syrian politics at the time. No regime had really lasted more than a few years. But then the Assad regime did, and it did more than survive, consolidating its power through vicious crackdowns. My father was close to securing a position in Aleppo when he thought we were all about to return, when he was told he would have to join the Ba'ath Party, the one and only political party in Syria and the party of the Assads, if he wanted the job. And so he began downsizing his dreams of home and his dreams of return. Though in his imagination, which he passed on to his children, which informed every day of our lives, Syria was ever present. My mother was much more pragmatic. She had still been in Syria for the early years of the regime. She didn't come to the US until 1974 when she came with me. And she had seen the crackdowns. She had seen people disappear into detention, never to be heard from again. Would Baltimore ever have the thrill of Damascus, which is the oldest still existing city in the world, the beauty of being a country on the Mediterranean, the place of all her memories and her good friends and her history? No, I mean, it obviously couldn't be, but she also did not want to see her own children disappear or be killed with impunity, as she had seen happen to her uncle, or to see property seized lawfully, quote unquote lawfully, and never return, which had happened to the very house she was meant to raise her own children in. That home, which is the literal home in the title of my book on Syria, was the home that her parents had moved into after they were married in the late 1940s. My grandmother was a new bride moving to Damascus, the capital, just as Syria emerged from decades of French colonization, an ancient country, but a newly independent state. That house, a 3rd-story flat and 4-story brand new building, was also new. My mother, the firstborn, had been raised in that house. And when her parents moved in 1970, 2 months before Hafiz al-Assad came to power, to a bigger apartment in a less crowded neighborhood, that house was left to my mother. After all, at that point, she was 20, in university, and as was the expectation, likely to marry in the coming years. So my grandmother, who owned the house, rented it out to a man in need. He was a wounded veteran who wrote beautiful poetry, and she loved poetry, as many Arabs of her generation did and really continue to this day. So she leased the house to him for a fixed term, knowing that, at the end of that term, my mom would be, about 25, and, life is not that unpredictable when it comes to the issues of marriage and raising families. So this was 2 months before Hafiz al-Assad came to power in 1970. Long story short, in the end, neither the tenant nor the dictator ever left, and the tenant was protected by the law. And that's sort of the central metaphor in some ways of the book. But with no home to return to, and with a family member having been murdered with impunity by someone affiliated with the regime, there was no return in the end for our family here in the United States. So my father waited for something to give. And when it didn't, he planned to split his time between the US and Syria once his 4 children were grown, and he planned to semi-retire and volunteer in Syria as a doctor, if nothing else. Then in 2004, the property law in Syria changed. It was sort of the appearance of a kind of reform. And at that point, Bashar al-Assad was already in power. And my parents initiated the lawsuit that was necessary to get their own house back. And the law, if they were to win the lawsuit, would allow them to pay the tenant to leave at a cost of 40% of the house's value. And finally, 40 years later, in 2010, at the very end of 2010, they did get the house back. And my parents believe they now at least be able to return to what should have been their home for at least extended stays and trips, now that they were nearing retirement. For me, while growing up Syria seemed much more something to escape rather than embrace. And that's a long story. But as an adult, and probably not unfamiliar one to people who grow up in diaspora and sort of always go through that culture shock every time they go back. But as an adult, I had returned frequently. I was fascinated by the many layers of history and civilization, fascinated by not being alone, which we had been in the US. And then fascination sometimes turns to suffocation when you all of a sudden, when you go from having no relatives to having a lot of relatives. But with my chosen professions, I had been a human rights lawyer and then became a journalist. I couldn't live in Syria as I had in other parts of the Middle East, like in Lebanon and the West Bank and Palestine. After all, Syria is a totalitarian state, and being a human rights lawyer and a journalist is hazardous to your health in a totalitarian state. And if you don't know why, you can ask me later. But it is something to consider and something I have thought about endlessly in the last 4 years when you hear the press attacked here at the highest levels. But with the Arab Spring, as both a journalist and a human rights lawyer, I really wanted to be in Syria. But not because I was looking for a home. I had already long moved past those questions. And honestly, I find them tiresome. And I think it's tiresome for anybody to have to sit and listen to that story. So in the end, it was me, of all the people in our family, who moved to Syria in April 2011, 1 month into what had the uprising, which had just begun in Syria. And I had a plausible cover story, which is also needed in a totalitarian state that watches its people with an elaborate Stasi-like apparatus. But I say Stasi-like, invoking, the East German police apparatus, but in Syria, it was a much more brutal and less sophisticated version, of course. And there's a joke I tell in the book, and we can save it for after because we are short on time. But the renovation to the house to get it back to how it was in my mother and grandmother's day had begun at the same time that the Arab Spring had begun and the same time that the Syrian uprising had begun. My parents have been trying to manage it from afar. So I took over the project because it was not only a great story, cover story, and this is why, writers are sometimes the least favored people in a family, but it was also a great metaphor. And I thought I'd be renovating the house at the same time that people were taking back their country. And obviously the timetables had matched up so perfectly, in that we lost our house in 1970. We were beginning the process of taking it back and restoring it in 2011. So yeah, there were perfect parallels. But I'm not going to get into the history of what happened over the last almost 10 years in Syria, but that's not how it went. And instead, the metaphor crumbled, the country crumbled, and I found myself putting the house together as the country came apart. And that coming apart happened on many levels and in many ways, and that we're not going to get into. But for anyone following the news, hopefully even in the lightest of senses, that the destruction of homes as physical houses, as cities and towns, and the displacement, both voluntary and forced, both internally and then externally outside of Syria's borders, has been a large part of it. Being in Syria, as I was for the first 2 years of the uprising, when many others couldn't be, I'm a Syrian national, so I was able to be inside the country, though I, of course, never publicly declared I was doing journalism, and any bylines that I took were anonymous. Although I was very truthful about the fact with my family that I was working on a book about my grandmother, which really didn't dispel any suspicions about me, because people could not understand how you could write a nonfiction book about somebody who wasn't important. But we'll put that to the side for now. But being there, I did feel that I had the opportunity and the obligation to try to understand the how, the why, the when of how a country was no longer able to be a home for all its people. And for many of us, it was a shock. These are really some of the oldest, most continuously inhabited cities and places in the world. And the permanence of the regime had almost become something that people had taken quite for granted. I mean, there's still plenty of people who have been so raised on the propaganda about Hafez al-Assad that when he actually died, it was hard to believe it because the mythology had been so ingrained in everybody that he was never going anywhere. But also, how could it be a shock? You know, why would anyone believe in the permanence of home with all the reminders that were staring us in the face just in Syria? I can't see you, but this is the point where I would have asked, you know, how many of you think about Syria as a place of refuge as opposed to a source of refugees? And I don't know what you're answering, but ironically, in case you didn't know this, it actually has been a place of refuge, and easily for over a century. Waves of different fleeing and displaced populations have found a place in Syria. I think, you know, it's up to each of them to say if they felt it was their home, and I won't speak in their stead. But for example, Armenians, the survivors of the Ottoman genocide, the end of the line in the trains that deported them to their deaths was in Aleppo in Syria, and many of them survived in part thanks to the Syrians who took them in. Palestinians who were dispossessed by the creation of the State of Israel, Lebanese that were displaced by the civil war and the Israeli invasion of the South, Iraqis fleeing 2 different US wars. They were all in Syria, and they were people who I never imagined that the permanence of what had always been home for them was just illusory. And so, yeah, it probably shouldn't have come as such a surprise. And one of the many places I followed sort of the Syrian disintegration to was Yerevan, Armenia, and in the fall of 2012. And with Armenia again in the news with what has just happened with Azerbaijan, I thought maybe I would sort of take you down that road with me for a second. You know, Armenians have been, before even the survivors of the genocide, Armenians have been in Syria since at least the 11th century. You know, religiously inspired Armenians, and I should, in case you don't know, Armenia was one of the world's first countries to convert to Christianity, had been traveling and settling in the area in what is Greater Syria long before the genocide, for centuries, because of Greater Syria's sites of Christian pilgrimage. And by Greater Syria, Balad al-Sham, we're sort of talking about what is, you know, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, parts of Jordan. And so proximity to Jerusalem, proximity to Bethlehem, proximity to the other places of Christian pilgrimage brought them to Balad al-Sham, what kind of roughly translates to Greater Syria. And many of these Armenians had long been Arabicized, but they still maintained their religious customs and their language. But of course, with the genocide in the early 20th century, many of them fled to Syria. And those who did survive began to pick up the pieces of their lives in Syria. And refugee camps for Armenians in Aleppo would later become bustling Armenian neighborhoods as tents became cement dwellings and the camps evolved from limbo to permanency. Same story in Lebanon, those who then moved on to Borj Hamoud. And now anybody who knows Lebanon knows Borj Hamoud is not a refugee camp, but as a bustling part of Beirut. And many Armenians, in fact, stayed in Syria, made Syria their home, and became Syrian. And that community numbered an estimated 150,000 at its peak in the 90s. But in the years before 2011, numbers of Syrian Armenians had begun to visit Armenia, which is the country that borders Iran and Azerbaijan and Georgia, during the summer. And Armenia was also, of course, courting them. The Syrian Armenians were a wealthy, industrious part of Syrian society. And in June 2012, many of them had gone to Armenia on vacation as usual. But in July, a few months before my September visit in Yerevan, Aleppo, where many of Syria's Armenian community lived, erupted in violent battle between the regime and armed rebels. And Syrian families who had been vacationing in Yerevan kept putting off their return home until things cooled down in Aleppo. But instead, things only deteriorated, and many of these Syrian Armenians would end up staying years and in fact take Armenian citizenship, which was on offer to Syrian Armenians. So it was there 8 years ago that I really began to wonder about all the possible futures. Would Armenians go back to Syria? Would they become a bridge between a new Syria and the Caucasus? Would their presence and history in Syria, which once seemed innate, as had the Jews, who were all gone by 1992, as do now, for the Christians, recede? And would those who left be replaced with newcomers to Syria? We've all heard of the foreign fighters who came, seeking fame, fortune, redemption, meaning whatever in Syria. And, also with a lot of the Western countries not repatriating these people, will their children become the new Syrians? And the questions that would just, that I started to think about, they would continue to plague me. And that was, were waves of expulsion, migration, refuge, and exile just the natural course of things, with no tragedy greater or less than the other? And was permanence only ever illusory, even if we believed otherwise? And I kept asking these questions as the situation only got worse in Syria. By 2013, I came towards the summer of 2013, I came back to the United States. And in 2015, I was fully steeped. I was, on deadline for my book on Syria. But I was watching as Syrians, and obviously Iraqis and Afghans too, and there's no coincidence that these were the people who we started to see fleeing across the Mediterranean in that summer of 2015, even though that had really started the year before. And I watched them as they were, seeking safety far beyond their immediate borders, right? For Syrians, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, North Africa, they had already collectively taken in an estimated 4.8 million Syrian refugees. But, if those countries were safer places to be, they didn't provide an opportunity for a life. And instead, those host countries were limbos where Syrians, for the most part, were unable to work, study, and earn a livelihood. And such activities were greatly curtailed, if not outright prohibited, depending on the country. So people began to look west. And the Mediterranean, I think we tend to forget, is not, it's a short distance between, whatever we think of as over there and whatever we think of as the Western here. So dispensing with the weights, the cues, and the requirements of Western embassies and organizations, and handicapped by having a Syrian passport or no passport, we now live in a world where travel documents have become an important determinant of global privilege. An estimated 500,000 Syrians took to the sea just in 2015 alone. So if those who had been condemned to the tent, right, the refugee tent life, didn't have the means to leave the region, many of those Syrians fleeing across the sea did, even if it still meant an illegal and terribly dangerous journey via rubber dinghy, bus, train, ferry, taxi, and foot. And many of these refugees came from Syria's working middle class. They were teachers, bakers, construction workers, farmers, shop owners, university students, computer scientists, architects, interpreters, nurses, engineers. Not all of them would make it alive. Just in 2015, at least 3,500 people drowned at sea trying to reach Europe. And this story continues to go on and on. If you pay any attention, I think a 6-month-old baby just died in the crossing yesterday or the day before. Most of these folks had their sights on Germany, the country that had essentially opened a door to them, agreeing to take them in, as well as to let them transit from there on to other countries in the Schengen zone. So in the fall of 2015, I was, sitting there writing this book, on deadline for this book, but knowing that this was part of the story of the book I was telling, and that, as a journalist, as somebody who had sort of created this beat, I also had to make that journey. And obviously, personally, I had lived a version of it in some ways myself. I mean, in many ways, a profoundly different version. Leaving was my parents' choice, and we were not refugees, but immigrants and eventually citizens. But nonetheless, that process of becoming part of a place that we personally had no roots in and hadn't planned on making home was complex. And I knew that in 2015, the refugees arriving in Europe, the Syrians arriving in Europe, and Europe itself are going to face a similar, if not albeit a hyper accelerated process of becoming a part of each other. And, as I said, those questions raised weren't just personal. They were, also the object of my professional work, whether as a lawyer or as a journalist. In my time in Lebanon, I had represented refugees who had been escaping Iraq and Sudan in their UNHCR hearings. So in that summer of 2015, I had been so steeped in where these Syrians were coming from working on the book. And I had also done already so much extensive work on Arabs, Muslims, race, and immigration in America, the United States of America, arguably the most successful, if not complicated, multicultural Western nation, though I wonder if that even would still stands true today. I also had an idea, knew where they were coming from, also had an idea of where they were headed. So I went to, armed with an American passport and hence the ability to cross borders with dignity. My Syrianness always just a thing of exotic curiosity to border guards across Europe. Who would just ask me when they'd see me speaking to people without the right passports. They always said, hey, how do you speak their language? Only to have their jaws drop when I would tell them, well, I'm Syrian too. So I went on this journey on the so-called refugee trail. And for me, it sort of, it started in Turkey, and then I made my way to Kos, Greece, which was where a lot of Syrians were coming ashore. And I was, I had been in a garden, and I was drawn to a group of Syrians who were drinking coffee together, yet didn't seem to be quite a natural fit. They spoke in different accents. I could hear people from Damascus, the coast, and Idlib interior. And they included children, a veiled woman, 2 young women in shorts who could have passed for European tourists because of how we imagine what Syrians look like, and 2 men, one as strapping and confident as the other was skinny and unsure. And the latter 2 turned out to be pastry chefs, former competitors from a seaside town near Latakia, who were hoping to open a sweets shop together in Sweden. And the slight one was married to the veiled woman, and 3 of the children belonged to them. One child who smiled the entire time but remained silent was a 13-year-old who had been abandoned by the man entrusted to take him to Germany. The blonde and the red-headed young women were sisters from Damascus. Their mother was the daughter of Palestinian refugees, so already like a second wave of displacement within this family. And she had removed her veil the minute she set foot on Greek shores, and her golden curls had already gotten even lighter in the sun because they were stuck, all the Syrians at that time were basically stuck in Greece for 6 days at a time. She also had a teenage son, and he didn't know how to swim, and he had been teaching himself how to swim watching YouTube. In the event, they capsized during their crossings, and they hadn't at that point. I met them when they had made it across. But his sisters had insisted that he learn by doing while they waited for days in Turkey for the smugglers to secure their passage, and they taught him how to tread water at least. And while they were wearing bikinis with their blonde and red hair, they had passed for tourists who frolicked near them on the same beaches, who never even noticed they were rehearsing really for their lives. So I approached them all in this garden, and we began to talk. And I learned that they hadn't known each other before, but had met just days before when their rubber dinghy that they had shared with 40 other people had broken down in the middle of the Aegean Sea. And this group had worked together to fix it, and now they had decided to stick together while they awaited permission from the Greek government to move onward. And they each had in mind specifically different things, but generally they wanted life, safety, dignity, and opportunity. And I asked them if, this is what journalists do. I asked them if I could join them as they made their way to their respective destinations. And they said yes, which turned out to sort of be like one of the biggest privileges of my life. Eventually, they ended up in Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Not all plans, best laid plans, were not actualized. One family was completely split up, and I'm going to share my screen in a second. But since then, I've been back at least once a year to follow up on their lives and to see, what has changed with them, what's evolved, because the story is ongoing, and it's by no means is played out the way I would have predicted, and I expect to be surprised several more times. Still, I've decided to follow them over 10 years, though that number is arguably arbitrary for my next book, and so far they've allowed me to do that. I'm just going to quickly, let's see. I can share my screen, right? Yes, I think so. I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Yes, here we go. You should be seeing this, I hope. Or no, here we go. Maybe this is what you need to see. Okay, can I just get in the chat, or Nida, can you just tell me, can you guys see this?
We can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna show this to you. So this Oh, you can't see because this stupid thing is here. I can't move this. Okay, well, this is the map. It says Illusory Armenia, $2,400. And this literally was the map that many people were using to make this journey. So you can see it starts here in Izmir or Bodrums, where many other people started in Turkey. It tells you you're going to have to cross by sea. This is about the cost. When you get to Greece, then you have, this is Jazaira Yunaniye, so a Greek island, and then you'll take the boat to Athens, and then you have to take the train and to Thessaloniki, and it just kind of keeps going in this way where the final destination, I don't know how to get rid of this thing, is Germany, and you become happy stick figures at the end. And this was the family, this is one of the families I described to you. Here's Suhair, she's a Palestinian Syrian, and these were the two children that she made the journey with, Naila, Maysam, and Yusuf. And this family is the one, I told you a little bit about the others, the pastry chefs, but this was the family that is the focus of the dispatches that I've been writing in the New York Times, in part because they were split up and they now find themselves spread out across 2 countries and several cities. Let me see if I can, it won't give me the, yes, can I come back to the screen? Won't come back to the screen. Give me a second, I might have to reshare it. Let's go back. Okay, and then this was the other sister, Suad, who had made the journey first, and the 2 sisters ended up being arrested in Germany. And that's a long story for their travel documents, and never were able to join the rest of the family in the Netherlands. But this family, these 3 were also not able to stay together in the Netherlands because Suad had arrived earlier, so they were split up. I'll just show you a happy picture of them all, like one of their reunions and with their dogs. This is in Vlissingen, the Netherlands. What is next? Okay, and I'm gonna stop the sharing for a second. Actually, oh, sorry, let me just share this one more time so you can see. Just going to try to, for some reason it won't preview. Will not, give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm gonna have to do it this way. Okay, and then just so you can see the dispatches, 1 second. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you can, are you seeing this screen, the New York Times screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So this is the series that now runs in the Times, with the sort of showing you the story of what happened with each of them in this specific family. And of course, the question constantly comes up as to what is home. This is Suhair, the mom. This is her house in public housing in the Netherlands, in Vlissingen. This is her taking Dutch lessons. It's her and their dog, Musha, who they're all in love with. This is her in her vocational training for the learning how to work in a restaurant. Here she is taking her dog on a walk. Here's Yusuf's story, the son, who now finds himself, this was the day, this is one of the early days when I met them. This is, you can see he's a small child in the insanity that was going on in the Greek island. He is now top of his class at his like super brainiac public school in the Netherlands. But the idea of, there he is, now he has like long hair and stubble. So, he's peak teenager. But the idea of, the talk and the question of home becoming unattainable really, I mean, it was in the collective, but, Suad, who was the one in the family who had seen the most displacement, and that's in part because where she was at university, and then, fighting, moving into the area of the university she was in. For those who know Syria, she was Bukalamun. she then went to Jordan to try to continue her education, but it was much more expensive. So basically, in the 7 years since she had left Syria, she had been from Jordan to Turkey to the Netherlands. You know, she had bounced already between 5 different refugee camps. You know, she was the one that told me that the concept of home had become so unattainable that she had learned to live without it. And she told me she was looking much more to find herself than anything else. And there, you know, the 2 more pieces that are still to come are about the other 2 sisters who found themselves in Germany and then were split there. I just wanted you to sort of have an idea about them. You know, and this is where I sort of, you know, many of the conversations I've had with people as I've returned over and over to Europe, though not this year, since USA passports are now not welcome in the EU. You know, many of the conversations I've had no longer are about home. You know, people are focusing on survival, and also on happiness, and on, you know, more than surviving, on thriving, and have sort of, you know, made me question, you know, can the concept be dispensed with? And, you know, what changes when we dispense with the concept, and what replaces them, replaces it? And also, I should just say that, you know, as a journalist, I don't see my job as answering those questions, but really more posing them. You know, in the Syrian case, unlike in the Palestinian case, there is pressure for Syrians to return to Syria. But I would say that returning to Syria is obviously out of the question without justice and accountability. And, you know, with a few exceptions, that does not currently seem to be on the global agenda. And since I mean, we are at 30 minutes, but I have been told I was 40 minutes. So I'm just going to go a little bit, continue, because I want to also just add, you know, try to suggest, yes, Neda, can I?
Yes, go for it. I think we're all like so eager to hear more that it would be a combination to cut you off. So just please continue.
Okay, but the only thing is I want to figure out how I'm going to reopen this one slideshow that every time I tried to share the screen, because I do want to show you this.
Well, I just want to tell you that usually if it's already open in presenter view, it has issues with share screen. So try not to have it in presenter view or in the...
Oh, okay. Wait, I can show this to you another way. But before I just, if I can move on, I just wanted to also talk about other conversations that happened while I was on that trail, you know, as we were... I mean, it was insane, right? You're moving across, and I see that Jean Carstensen is on this call. Like, other journalists who've done this are on the call too. Like, it was crazy, right? And you're moving across borders, being stopped at borders, and, you know, I'm making this trip with people. And there's also, though, like, imagine, like, even in this like insanity, there are time for like intense conversations. And, you know, one of the things that Syrians and Iraqis also kept saying to me was that it was, you know, often as we were on this trail, that it was inconceivable to them that the likes of what was happening to their home in terms of brutality, loss, and displacement had ever been seen before in contemporary human history. And they despaired as to how their country could ever again emerge, let alone prosper. And they wondered how they could all live together after everything that had transpired between them. But ironically, right, we had these conversations as we journeyed through the states that had emerged from the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia. You know, I mean, not 100 miles from where we were sitting on one of the borders, one of the worst massacres of the Yugoslav war had occurred along sectarian and ethnic lines. You know, and of course, I couldn't help but think, but the residents of these places had also once wondered how had everything come apart so quickly. You know, and even as the refugees that I was speaking to were completely focused on reaching the European Union, you know, I mean, we have to remember that the EU itself was created in the wake of bitter conflict, right? After erstwhile enemies had decided that they had more to gain by confronting and reconciling with the past, as opposed to just forgetting it, which tends to be, you know, amnesia, it tends to be the more preferred way in other parts of the world, and moving through it and then forging that future together. And similarly, you know, when I was making this journey, the xenophobic discussion about the refugees had reached a fever pitch in Europe, and it seemed that many Europeans themselves had forgotten their own past of devastation and migration. And that's where the idea from Europa came about, which I'll show you quick images from in a second, that, you know, if you tell the story of Europe through war and displacement, as a way to introduce contemporary Europe to these newcomers, and also for people who are currently in Europe to revisit it, that maybe recognition of each other or of themselves and each other could be a kind of replacement for home. And let me just see if I can't pull these images up. Maybe I'll just do this the old-fashioned way. No, it's still gonna go into preview and then, okay, it's gonna, okay, I think I can share my screen like this real quick. Let's see, this is the one to show you. Is it sharing?
No.
No, okay. Now is it sharing?
Yes.
Okay, so this is where Europa came from. It's a book in 4 languages. It reads both ways. So it harnesses the power of like the photographic archive of Magnum, which really, you know, sometimes the pictures, you know, without a caption, is it Syria? Is it Iraq? Is it Dresden? I mean, it's kind of, is it Germany? Is it refugees moving across borders in the wake of the creation of the Soviet Union? And, oh, it's not going to, sorry, let's do it this way. And this is sort of how he chose to tell the story. I think it's not going to. Okay, well, take my word for it. Let's just skip. We're just gonna have to skip that. Sorry, it keeps sort of freezing. Anyway, so as for, so, you know, these are some of the things that maybe replace home, you know, justice, accountability, recognition. As for my father, you know, in 2013, only a year after I had finished the renovation and moved in and begun to live in the house in Damascus that had been sort of the core of this, you know, family quest for 40 years, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And that was before the chemical attacks on civilian populations, before Russian military involvement, before the siege and the starvation of entire towns in Syria. So hope for Syria's future didn't yet seem, you know, completely foolish. And besides, his prognosis had been so bleak that we didn't expect Syria's situation to change much in the time he had left. So when he declared that, you know, at least he wanted to be buried at home next to his parents, who he had spent a lifetime away from, in a cemetery in Damascus, you know, we agreed. We promised that we would make that happen. But fortunately for us, my father outlived his prognosis, but at a time when Syria was already in a kind of free fall. And so, you know, he's thought that, and this is very morbid, I'm sorry, but he then started to think that transporting a body to Damascus might be like really difficult. So maybe he would go there while he was still alive to die at home. But then with no clarity on when that day would be, he chose not to be separated from us, a family that did include his grandchildren. So again, he asked that when the time did come, you know, would we try to bury him in Syria? And then Syria continued to collapse, but never quite bottoming out. And in what would be his last year, he actually finally renounced that desire. He didn't want to be in a grave that couldn't be visited. And at this point, my book had come out, and I sort of probably not super welcome in Syria. And so, you know, looking at me with both blame, but also admiration for having, you know, dared to believe something else, he did say, well, you won't be able to come. So, and there, who is left to visit me? And I just want to say that, of course, that he had the time to ponder where to be buried was the burden of knowing for several years that he was dying. But it was also a luxury because, I mean, especially for a Syrian, of still having some choice in that matter. So on that note, had you timed me correctly, I would have been 40 minutes exactly. I'm going to end it there, and we can sort of interrogate these questions together.
Oh, Alia, thank you. Thank you so much. I don't want to say furthermore because what you said has been really impactful. I want to, again, just remind you to get her book if you haven't. It's a really phenomenal memoir of Syria. And without further ado, if that's okay, I would like to sort of transition immediately to the panel. And just to give us a little bit more time for the panelists to ask their questions and then eventually also have a conversation all together. So join me in thanking Alia for her talk, and then quickly transitioning into the panel with, you know, Dr. Jake, Katherine, as well as Dr. Nadine Sino. Kathy, thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Alia,
as you were talking about how you being a journalist, you ask the questions and don't answer them, I'm flipping a script on you here. I get to ask the questions now, and you get to answer them. So thank you for being here and answering questions today.
It's called the artful dodge. I mean,
yeah.
we'll see.
What I'd like to talk about first is this concept of home. You were talking about the destruction of physical home in one place, and then the process or the difficulty in building home in a new place. And you hinted at this and talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to ask, what makes a place home? And then what are the barriers to attaining that after displacement? What were the things that made it difficult for people? And Alia, if you want to start us off, and then maybe Jake and Nadine, you can contribute. And please feel free to make this conversational. I don't just want to go down the line as I ask these questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. And I can't speak on behalf of everybody, but I mean, obviously a welcome means already, I mean, just like I look, you know, I've had the opportunity to observe the different ways that Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands have dealt with their refugee populations, while of course being in a country that, especially in the last 4 years, has declared itself hostile to refugees, even as this is the country that bears much more of, you know, the responsibility in many ways for the destabilization of these regions. But, you know, what in the different stages of you know, because now we're 5 years into that mass migration, I would say, you know, the dignity helps a lot, right? If you are given a home, right? So I went to the public housing in these places. Like the public housing is dignified. You know, the windows are large. You know, you're not you're not in some kind of banlieue, right? You have access to the city, you have access or whatever to the center of the town, wherever that might be. You know, all these investments in people trying to learn the language. I mean, those, you know, and like not all the refugee camps or whatever they're called, you know, centers, they all have different terms in those countries. I mean, some of them are horrible. They were like in muddy, you know, trailers, but then, you know, eventually people within a year, like people had been assigned to their housing. You know, and this is very different than how refugee resettlement works in the United States, obviously, right? You know, you're given very little money and it falls to private actors, churches, other resettlement agencies, good neighbors to try to help you land on your feet, and you have to pay that money back. So you know, but then there are caps on dreams, right? I do feel that, you know, one of the frustrations that, you know, Maysam, the daughter, I didn't get a chance to tell you yet about the 2 daughters in Germany, what's going on with them as sisters. You know, she had finished a year of art school at the, like, you know, the fine arts university in Damascus, and she has now achieved a very high level of German proficiency, but she doesn't have access to German universities in the way that somebody here in the United States, if they reach that proficiency in English and scored high, you know, there's a lot more sort of funneling people into vocational jobs and schools. So, you know, I think that's really a roundabout way of saying that, you know, dignity and a welcome and some stability to get your life going probably means a lot. But, you know, happiness and whether you can actualize the dreams that you have really that's individual.
Great. Nadine or Jake?
Yeah, I will echo a lot of what you just said. And Alia, thank you very much for your talk. You know, both in the work we've done at the Blacksburg Refugee Partnership and also in the research that I've done, I think this question of dignity is really important, and just the kind of difficult material circumstances people find themselves in the United States context when people come as refugees and resettle. As you said, Alia, they have really time-limited financial support. It's pretty brief. They often end up in areas of whatever city they've resettled in that maybe have housing that's inadequate both for refugees and for the local residents. That was something that a lot of people I spoke with in my interviews with Iraqis said when they worked with the refugee resettlement agencies when they came to the US, they were in terrible apartments with infestations of bugs and, really inadequate and unlivable. So that was pretty difficult. But then I think in the long term, this question of what are the opportunities to engage in their communities, I think is really a big part of it. The idea that there are, depending on the context, different opportunities that are available. So a lot of the people that I spoke with, and these were people living in mostly the Northeast of the United States, who said what they really looked forward to was the opportunities to meet Americans, people living in their communities, to kind of talk with them, to exchange, to both learn about American culture, but also to share aspects of their Iraqi culture, maybe religious culture, whatever it happens to be, and to in some ways create an amalgamation of those two things, to have those reciprocal kinds of processes, was something a lot of the people I spoke with said they had personally found very valuable. So I think that aspect as well is the ability to, become a member of the community, for lack of a better way to say it.
And just very quickly, first, Alia, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I also agree that it's going to be different from one person to another. And for me, maybe I've given up on the concept of home as a fixed place that, you move from A to B. Maybe it's more of a dynamic place that can be contentious. Home can break your heart, and you can also fall in love with it. And you can choose also where to make a home, right? So for me, at least with my experience as an immigrant, but also as interviewing refugees, for a lot of them, sometimes even before the paperwork comes, someone feels at home, right? I was in the US for 15 years before I actually became an American citizen. But for the longest time, that was the only place I knew. But Lebanon will always be home, was where I was born and raised, right? My husband was my home for the longest time when I was sure they were gonna deport me, right? So I think it's a dynamic, contentious place. And for some it's safety, and for others it's more precarious. And so as long as, maybe we need to give up on the concept of a fixed place or a happy place necessarily, and just be comfortable with being placeless even.
Yeah, and that goes back to Alia, the point you made about moving past that concept and moving more towards happiness or security. So with that in mind, what I was thinking about as you were talking is how critical refugee studies has pushed back against this, the concept of assimilation into a dominant culture as part of resettlement. And we have the conversation has moved more towards integration, which is the idea is that it's a two-way street, that communities and resettling refugees are both adapting to kind of this new environment. I'd argue that there's still a disproportionate expectation put on resettling refugees, but how can we as local communities, and after we talk about communities, we'll talk about kind of the state level responsibility, but as local communities, and Jake and I are both with the Blacksburg Refugee Partnership, so I'm a little bit biased toward this part of it, how do we help facilitate that? If we're moving past the concept of a very fixed place, sense of home, what should communities be involved in as far as integration? And how do we do that without just being like the white savior, right? And just going in and saying like, we can fix all the problems.
I like how you just threw that in at the end.
I know, I'm sorry, that's like a whole other question. I wanted to make sure I got it in there.
On the white savior thing. And I mean, listen, we are completely bound to each other, right? It was Afghans, Iraqis, and Syrians crossing the sea. It was not, it wasn't people from other places. And you would have to commit a lot of mental gymnastics and logical gymnastics to think that the fact that the United States has been involved for the last at least 20 years in military activity in those regions, that's not related to the outflux of
Absolutely.
Of these people. Mm-hmm. And I know you guys know all of this, but I think, and I've been amazed not only at the resilience, but the willingness to not be angry with the United States as a monolithic thing on behalf of refugees, probably because they've been exposed to American culture, American idea. Like America is not a single thing, is not a single narrative to a lot of people. But I think an acknowledgement of that I am not here saving you, that I am in part like, trying to mitigate the consequences of actions that, my own country, like that's already like a different kind of attitude. And, I think that goes a long way. On the idea of, I don't know if I'll be able to answer your question. You guys probably know better as you work, specifically with integrating folks into your communities. But the one idea I kept coming back to, and then we emphasize in Europa, and I'm sorry I couldn't throw up the other slides, is that culture is not fixed. Europe did not emerge from the sea like Venus, Venus, and like that's always how it's been. Like massive displacements and migrations have defined the Europe that we know today. Same with the United States, and a lot of that make America great again, and like this idea, this nostalgia for places, ideas of culture and society that are fixed need to somehow move past. I mean, these things are constantly in creation, and so I think we have a choice to make. Do you create a new? Do you as these folks come in, is it, and people have been very resilient. I mean, America has not been a welcoming place. First of all, created by, dispossessing and, genocidal policies, bring half its, huge part of its population brought over in bondage. And then every group that's sort of since come over having to sort of prove itself and sort of get on board with the plan. And, I think Germany has tried to make a different decision, a more affirmative decision as to how it's going to go into its future. But I think recognition, I mean, like, I'm sort of trying to hit all your points. Like, as a journalist,
it was a big question. This is great.
As a writer, I think in terms of the kind of work that I do and the kinds of, and what I teach my students, I think, a lot of people sort of come into journalism wanting to show, that people who have been demonized in the press are not just that. And sometimes there's this temptation to overcompensate and only show superlative and perfect people and grateful refugees and assimilating refugees. But, I don't, perfect people are never recognizable to me. And I think, so what I try to do, oh, sorry, I see one of the professors is in the chat, and that's why I'm actually speaking to you, because we grew up on the same class. But yeah, I think, if the journalism would be a little less sensationalistic and a little more robust, I mean, that is also helpful. And also, honestly, like, and I know everyone's having the anxiety of going home for Thanksgiving because of COVID, but also because family and relatives. But like, I think a lot of these conversations need to happen like on a family level. Like, you push back on, when, the rhetoric about others is problematic. I know it would just be easier to eat your pumpkin pie, but, you might want to also they're going to listen to you before they're going to listen to me. So those are multifaceted. And should I answer Elizabeth? But I want to hear from you folks, and I'll think about Elizabeth's question. Consider Towson a home. Should I answer that now? I mean,
no. How about we hear from Nadine and Jake, and then we'll go back to your personal experiences with home.
I mean, on the question of saving, that's the ultimate question. But I always tell my students, a lot of the time when they end up being volunteers, the refugees are the ones who also save their lives in many ways. And just because you're sort of like, knowledge is never like top down, right? Just because someone, I remember once being at a party, this is a little bit anecdotal, when I was very young, when I first came to the States. And I remember someone telling people, oh, she's smart, don't be fooled by the accent, right? And people were like, wow, right? But one thing is, I mean, that guy was actually very in touch with reality, right? So you hear someone with an accent, or you're talking to a refugee, and just because they can't understand your language doesn't mean that they're not much smarter than you on so many other levels, right? Doesn't mean that they cannot teach you something. I mean, again, not all refugees are the same, but someone who has been through so much heartache, someone who has endured a lot, someone who has taken a risk to move to another place, there is a chance that you're going to learn something from them. and that they might be the ones who end up in one way or another saving you, or saving you from a very boring, very limited existence and imagination, right? So allow yourself to touch and be touched by others is what I would say, and to recognize that we're all vulnerable and there's so much that we can learn from each other. Whether it's, I tell when COVID happened, I told my students, I'm here to tell you we're going to get through this, because we didn't have internet when we, sat around the candlelight and did homework with my sisters, right? So people can teach you something, even though they may not be as great as you are at your language. So please, or at filling out paperwork, right? So just allow yourself to realize beyond the language barrier what others can teach you.
Yeah, and I would add as well, I think to this, I was struck with the capacity for forgiveness, this idea that people are able to get over the anger about what the United States has done in their countries. I mean, I'm personally very angry about all of the harm that the United States causes around the world, all of the lives it destroys invading various countries. And, so I'm struck by that. And I think that's a really important aspect. I mean, I think forgiveness ought to be led ultimately by those who have been harmed. So it's not my place to say, you must forgive me for what my government has done. I think if it's going to happen, it's the other, it's their responsibility if they want or not. And again, maybe not. And I think that's totally understandable. I think as well in this question of integration and assimilation, assimilation, I think obviously we've moved away from with good cause, and I think that's a good thing. It's a term that's really fallen out of favor, and I think we should reject fully. I even think that integration is an insufficient way to think about these processes, the lives, the people we're talking about. In my own view is we should really be striving for something more along the lines of, the sort of Vulcan idea of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, right? This Roddenberry, Star Trek kind of idea that really ultimately what we are striving for is an understanding, a recognition, and a putting into practice of the fact that everyone is different and unique in different ways. We all have different backgrounds and different experiences. And in fact, it's a good thing that that's the case, and that there really is no such thing as a homogenous culture or society. There never has been. And even those that appear homogenous, when you look even just a little bit deeper, are not in fact. And so, in terms of the United States, I think that's ultimately what we ought to be doing. I think Alia said at the beginning, we've had an experience with multiculturalism. In some ways, we've been successful, maybe more successful than some other places. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And ultimately, we keep going. And I talked about those processes that the people I interviewed spoke about, and this mixing, this amalgamation. I think that's possible, although it's difficult. And it's always going to be an ongoing process. And I think that's kind of ultimately what I would say as well, is that there is no end stage to it. There is no, of course, there's no assimilation, but there's also no integration. There's no fully resolved state where a newcomer, whether they're a refugee or an immigrant or someone born into the society, whoever they are, is ever fully a part of, because it's always dynamic, it's always changing. And again, we should accept that as an empirical fact. And I also think as a normative good. That's a good thing, and we should be actively cultivating it.
Yeah, go ahead, Ali.
No, it's exciting. I mean, fusion is exciting. But I do, I know because we're focused on the super local level, but I think a lot of that, you can signal a lot from the very, very top. I mean, I just think of, and I know like Jacinda Ardern is like New Zealand's like not a perfect place, but like just the power in her reaction after the mass shooting at the mosques in New Zealand is like that's powerful signaling. So it's bottom up, top, and top down as much. Yeah.
Yeah, that Jake, you talking about the multiculturalism, or ties back to I think what Alia was talking about earlier about how culture is not something that is objectively removed from lived experience, right? Culture is built, and I think that's especially important. I think with during a time of when we're focusing on what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to not be a xenophobic people and culture and country. right? And pushing back against this idea that there is like a culture to be assimilated into, and what that looks like and what it means to reject that. So thank you all for that. Alia, did you want to, there was a question in the chat about how you personally.
Yes, well, I want to shout out for,
Yeah.
I guess it's called Grant. I knew Elizabeth by a different last name. Hi, Elizabeth. Yeah, she wants to know if I think of Baltimore, Towson as home. I mean, I'm so past, I'm a little bit past that. Yes, in many ways, sure. Yeah, but I also, yeah, I guess I just don't think like that. It's not what I'm thinking about anymore or these days. And it's really yes, I'm lucky that I can sort of come to Baltimore and be a part of Baltimore, and no one contests my belonging here. So, but yeah, but I mean, did I ever consider Towson a home? I mean, it was, no, when we were neighbors on the street, like it was very sort of a clear demarcation that in our minds that somehow that wasn't actually home. Because
yeah,
we were children.
It's odd to me to remember it from my eyes, which obviously are very different. I just remember you and I had the same house, only yours was a mirror image of my house. Literally, remember that?
I was at the bottom of the court. You were up the street.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and you were so, I mean, this is getting too personal to me, but Alia was like a superstar in high school. And so like reading and hearing what you say now, it's just amazing, my cultural blinders of not knowing. And so I just wanted to express that historically.
Well, we were all kids.
The next question I want to ask is about what we've been touching on, not just on the community level, but on the level of the state and government. What do you all think the influence and responsibility is of the United States and so-called Western countries and powers regarding international displacement?
I mean, huge.
Yeah, I know. It's like you could write a book about it, and then we could report back in 6 months. We can talk about them, you know.
Somebody else want to answer? I think the thing that cripples Americans in many ways the most is an utter unawareness of history. And an unwillingness to expand on their understanding of their own history. I mean, it has just been remarkable that, you know, all the doubling down in the wake of, you know, we're finally kind of maybe talking about race in a semi-honest way in this country. And yet, you know, it's so impossible to, the entrenchment, you know, as if somehow it's taking away from you or taking away from something if we have those honest conversations. I mean, my student who's on this call is going to laugh, but I'm about to say, if you haven't read this book yet, this is necessary reading. It's Notes on a Foreign Country by Susie Henson, which it's an entire exploration of American nationalism and why it is created in a way that Americans are unable to see, you know, for lack of a better word, the empire. Why American nationalism blinds you from seeing America's role in the world and what it has done, and why it creates this renewed perpetual innocence. And I just feel like without any kind of like true, honest reckoning of who we are, and I say we, none of us are, you know, forgiven. Like, you know, even if we come here, you know, not having been slave owners, like we are all part of this, like participating in the society and creating the society. And for Americans who are finding it difficult to understand what America's role in the world has been in the American century, as it has been the only, like, you know, one of the superpowers and now the only superpower, I cannot, you know, more highly recommend it. I'll drop it in the chat if you don't, you know, just have it. But anyway.
So one of the things I'll say is, let's go back to basics with displacement. For me, don't wage war against other countries and don't support war in other countries would be my first thing, because that is going to be the first thing that causes displacement in the first place, right? So just to be mindful about that. But then once that happens, once the US gets involved in this in one way or another, then we have a responsibility toward populations that we have displaced and whose homes have been destroyed. And that, you know, that involves, I mean, we need policies then that involve making sure that there's protection against discrimination, that there is proper vocational training, language training, and resources for that. Finding ways to reduce the cost of transferring remittances that these new immigrants will have to do when they want to support people at home. And as Alia said in her lecture, we are all extremely connected. And as COVID has shown us, like one problem in one place is going to affect all of us. So even if we were self-serving, to just keep in mind that we're so interconnected, and if we don't think of our world this way, it's going to backfire for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we have a responsibility, and the major thing we can do is to not wage war, to stop invading other countries, and also to understand, take a broad understanding of what it means to fight conflict, what it means to do war. We've been at war essentially nonstop in Iraq, not just since 2003, but since 1991. The war never ended after what we call the Gulf War. It continued throughout the 90s. Under Bill Clinton, and then under Bush, and then Obama, and then Trump, and it continues to the present day. And so we have things like aerial bombardment, we have things like sanctions, which are war, not even by other means, but are just simply war. Blockading other countries causes immeasurable harm. These are all things we can just simply stop doing. Currently, we're seeing a situation in Yemen, for example, where the conflict's been going on since 2014 or thereabouts. It occasionally gets called the forgotten conflict because it doesn't get as much attention as perhaps it should in global media. The Saudi bombardment, the blockade have really been devastating for the people of Yemen. It's created a massive displacement crisis. There was another report just yesterday saying that they're on the verge, millions of people are on the verge of famine again. There have been cholera outbreaks, COVID outbreaks. And again, the US has been supporting that conflict since the beginning. It's been, of course, it has for many years sold the weapons to Saudi Arabia to fight that war. It's been refueling the fighter jets that are doing most of the harm, most of the damage, most of the killing in that country. And it's been giving diplomatic cover to Saudi Arabia. So all of these things are things we just simply shouldn't do and don't have to do. And if we didn't do them, there would be fewer displaced people, there would be fewer destroyed lives. And by and large, people would be safer, happier, and healthier in many parts of the world. And I think that is really central. And I think it's absolutely right that there's this, I don't know if it's particular to the United States, but there is a sense in the United States that no matter what actions we take, they're always done with good intentions. So even if we do these things and we harm these people and we cause death on a scale that's unimaginable, we kill millions of people in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, well, we had good intentions when we were trying to do it. And so we're absolved in some way. But I don't agree. And I think that's quite strange. In fact, I think it's morally deficient. And I spend a lot of time thinking about this and advocating and agitating and trying to get more Americans to understand that that's really the responsibility we have. I mean, it's our own government. It's ostensibly democratic. That's a whole other question. But it's also a bipartisan project. It's not just Donald Trump or the Republican Party who do these things, but it's both parties, and that's historically been the case. The empire started at least 100 years ago with the invasion of the Philippines. It really started before that with the conquest of the continent. And at every point, this involves displacement. It involves all of these things. And I think understanding that is how we get through it. Understanding and taking responsibility and actually doing something about it. That's really ultimately what policy-wise we need to do. That's what I would say is the solution to these things. It's not always the case. It's not the case in every country in the world. But if you look at the top countries that are having people displaced from them, where there are the most refugees or the most internally displaced persons, it's countries where either the US is at war, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and on and on and on. But it's also places like Colombia, where we've supported the government's war against people in the country. It's Palestinians, so we can simply stop supporting the occupation of Palestine and we can solve these problems. So that's what I would say.
Absolutely, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. What I'd like to ask is a very topical kind of question. And now we do have a new president-elect and a new administration that hopefully will be addressing these concerns more positively. But how can we address the concerns well, okay, I'm going to say that people have made them concerns, and we can talk about whether they actually should be, right? But the Trump administration has taken the COVID crisis and used it as an excuse to shut down the border, right? And shut down the refugee resettlement program, put many more restrictions on the border as far as people seeking asylum. And what can we do now that we're facing a new presidential administration? What can we do as citizens to maybe reconsider those things and maybe agitate for something different? Or maybe how can we address the concerns that, you know, having people brought in will somehow contribute to like COVID spread?
Oh, COVID specifically?
No, I would not say. I'm using that as a because that's the relevant excuse at this moment. And this is not a very objective question. Obviously, you know where my loyalties lie here. But how do we address kind of these current moments of trying to police the borders in certain ways that exclude refugees and asylum seekers?
I mean, somebody else want to start with that one?
Again,
I mean, as a journalist, it's also not exactly my place to prescribe policy, but to remind people that, I'm going to kick this one off, and then maybe I'll say something at the end. But it's go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead,
Jake.
I'm happy to say a few words. And so I think a couple of things. Right, we're having a change of administration, which is by and large a good thing, of course, better than the alternative. You have two choices. That was the better choice, the better alternative. And I think there's reason to be at least cautiously hopeful, cautiously optimistic that some of the policies regarding immigration will actually change, will potentially revert to some of the Obama era policies. So we are likely to see a repeal of the travel ban. We're likely to see a re-ramping up or a re-increase of refugee resettlement, the existing program. I would guess something along the lines of the numbers we saw under Obama, which is significantly more than what the Trump administration has done and has tried to do. But we need more than that, of course, and we need significantly more than that. There were also policies under Obama that were incredibly harmful and damaging. We saw mass deportations, for example. And all of these, again, policies are deeply historically rooted. There has always been attempts to get rid of, to prevent from coming in and to get rid of undesirable, so-called populations, people, however they're defined in particular historical moments. And so what I think we need, and I'll kind of draw on my research for this, is mass mobilization and mass action. We need to attempt as best we can to push the incoming administration to do what is necessary and what needs to be done. When the travel ban was initially signed, it was essentially Trump's first act in January of 2017, barring people from these 7 countries, and it shifted a little bit over time, from coming into the country as refugees. What we saw in response were massive demonstrations, protests, occupations of places like airports. You saw, and not only that, you saw this kind of acute moment where there was mass actions, people on the street, and also continuing efforts, legal efforts, and others to try to change this policy, to try to push back against it. I conducted my interviews for my research starting in September of 2017. So some of the people I spoke with had actually participated in these actions, for example, were living in New York City and had gone to JFK after the travel ban was signed to protest, to do translation, to try to connect with people. And for a number of people I spoke with, they found this both on a personal level very powerful, this idea that people could go out, they could resist the government, in particular the federal government, the sort of ultimate or top power in the country, try to push back and demonstrate, no, actually, we don't want this policy. We think it should be reversed. And the fact that it wasn't just refugees, it wasn't just immigrants who were doing this, but it was also Americans, native-born Americans, who were also at the protests, who were kind of joining together with newcomers to say, no, we do want you here, we welcome you here, we don't support what the president is doing, what the government is doing. This had a big impact. It was ultimately unsuccessful, at least for now. The Supreme Court upheld the travel ban. But again, it led to some of the people I spoke with at least feeling more secure, less precarity, more safe in their communities, in their homes. And it also spun off ongoing activism. So a number of organizations were formed in the wake of this that are continuing their work, that are doing really interesting things in New York City and elsewhere. And so I think that's what we need. We need to use whatever levers we have and those we can find collectively to try to push an even further positive direction, more resettlement, fewer restrictions, and so forth.
I mean, I would just add, no, that was comprehensive. And I will not say what we should do, but I would add that those are also still, we're in the situation of reacting to what is happening, right? The root causes, and if you want to speak very specifically about Syria and Biden, the Biden administration coming in, I mean, Biden still has on his foreign policy team, I think a lot of the folks that were architects of the Iran deal. So if we're going to go back to Iran and have another conversation with Iran, then this time, which my understanding was it was not part of the equation last time under Obama, like Iran's actions in the region have to be discussed, right? Russia's actions in the regions have to be discussed. So the Saudis' actions in the regions have to be discussed. I mean, these proxy wars that are sort of being fought in the Middle East are, you know, the U.S. is not the only player that destabilized Iraq. I mean, Iran got in on that very quickly, as did the Gulf. Same thing happened again in Syria. In all these, you know, it's all these large macro things that are creating these outfluxes of populations, and even our allies, Erdogan, like using, and our allies, I mean, like NATO, the United States, I mean, using the refugees as a pawn. I mean, we can, you know, although the mobilization is very necessary to like immediately mitigate the devastating impacts of these policies, but like the strings are up here, and we have to figure out a way, I think, to, you know, the United States has, and that's what we're all waiting for to see, like, how is the United States going to redefine its role, its foreign policy role? You know, it was clear that the Syrian regime in this specific example was not going to, that Iran was not going to allow the regime to fall. And then Russia dipped its toe into it. And it was clear the United States was not confronting Russia either in Syria, in the Ukraine, in other places. So, you know, when, you know, a lot of these things are happening very much on people's individual lives levels, are things that are happening up here. So, you know, we can be much better readers of the news or policy, like actually have a, you know, not sort of, and I think this has changed. I think that the democratization of platforms has meant that, you know, back when I was growing up, the like unanimity on America being pro-Israel, and that Israel, you know, being the only a positive actor in the region, the Palestinians only being the spoilers, you know, that I think that has, you know, I don't think anybody can even say that with a straight face anymore, but it was not so long ago that was, you know, the consensus. And it's not that long ago that professors like Stephen Saleta were unable to hold jobs for even dissenting. So I'm not saying we're in the clear there, but, you know, a lot of this is happening so high above the heads of you know, and we're here trying to get the, you know, the deluge in buckets, and it shouldn't fall to us. But I think, you know, you are absolutely correct that it is falling to private actors and individuals to sort of stem the tide of devastation that is like really being rained down on a lot of people's lives. But like, how do, you know, and this is for people, this is above my pay grade, but you gotta, you know, it's got to be at a, you know, at a much higher level to change it, to fundamentally change it, as opposed to just healing it or catching it. You know?
Nadine, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I just wanted to echo what Jake and Alia said, and one of the things that Jake said is, let's not get also too comfortable, because, and breathe a sigh of relief. The new administration also has to be kept honest on promises that it has made about redefining America's role. And again, I am worried and extremely cautiously optimistic about foreign wars, but also, you know, we just also remind them that the test of our humanity is not when everything is great. Yes, there is COVID, and yes, there are precautions. What can we do to safely make sure that the transfer of people is done in a way that is good for everybody involved? And so just to keep echoing that, you know, yeah, it's going to be difficult, and there's always going to be a reason. And with different administrations, there's been revoking of visas and deportations. And so let's not give excuses when there are ways to fight for things. I think no matter who is the president.
I appreciate all of you taking a convoluted question and making it so clear through your answers. That was great. Thank you. And it looks like we are out of time for the Q&A. Thank you all so much. This was really great to hear from all of you in your areas of expertise. And I feel like I've learned a lot, so thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you all. And please join me in thanking every person that was involved in organizing this. Alia, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your contribution. Jake and Nadine and Katherine, you've done an amazing job. Thank you all for being here. This was a very successful talk with really high attendance. We're very happy that you've all decided to join us. Would like to remind you to follow us, CCC activities, that this talk will be available online as well, the recording, so you're free to share it with your friends and colleagues that weren't able to make it here. And just one last really thank you for the fabulous work that CCC members have done, and I think particularly about Neda and Lara as well, and Molly, and all the involvements of all other members in making this possible. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Now I have a question. Is the chat also saved in the recording?
I believe not. I mean,
okay.
It's separately, but not in the recording.
Okay. Could I go ahead? Elvira made a really great comment in the chat. Can I just read it so that it's on the record for the recording?
Yeah.
Okay, he said, Alia, thank you so much for your story and sharing the story of Syrian refugee experience. As a former Bosnian refugee, we experienced displacement, a struggle to assimilate and thrive. My mother and father moved back to Europe, specifically Croatia, because they never felt the sense of belonging, plus they never wanted to leave. We've been in the US since 1995, and as I get older, I feel more drawn to my own culture, which I define as home. I experience it through language mainly. My one advice for local communities is to provide access for refugees to express their own culture. I thought that was really great, so I wanted to make sure that was recorded.
Yes, Elvira, if you are with us, thank you for sharing. And again, we appreciate everyone's presence and participation here. And yeah, we look forward to having you in another event soon.
Thank you, Neda, and everybody. Nadine.
Thank you all.